Hello and welcome to this short course on podcasting. My name is Rob O'Connor, and I'm with the South East Technological University of Ireland, SETU. My academic background is computer science, but I also have extensive professional experience in music and radio, and I've been podcasting for years, and that's really ramped up over the last while. This course is an introduction into podcasting. It's not tied to any one genre or style, though it is geared towards academic works rather than commercial outputs. Now, a lot of the technicalities are the same, but we won't be exploring how to book celebrity guests or go viral on social media or anything like that. However, if you are interested in learning how to go about creating your own podcasts that encompass everything from planning to recording to publishing a finished piece on the likes of Spotify, well, then this is for you. Now, as we start this course, it is assumed that you have some idea that you would like to turn into a podcast. And that can be anything you want. It can be a one-off piece, or it can be an ongoing series. I want you to think about that all the way through, whatever your idea is and what you'd like to turn it into. So what we're going to do in this introductory section is we're going to lay out a definition for what podcasting is, and also what it's not. We'll talk briefly about some listenership statistics, and then we'll talk about the process that goes into actually creating a podcast, and which finally just lays out how this course. So we'll start by defining podcasting, and we'll start by defining it by what it's not. So podcasting is not radio. They are related. Obviously, radio is oral media. Podcasting is mostly oral media. But radio is synchronous, whereas podcasting is asynchronous. And what I mean by that is radio is typically live. It happens and then it moves on. Whereas podcast is on demand as opposed to linear. And now, obviously, radio, there's listen back facilities, and a lot of radio shows are podcasts as well. But I would like to think of things as, if you think of the relationship between, say, the likes of Netflix and TV, as in television, broadcast television, that's the same kind of relationship between podcasting and radio. Also, podcasting is not just a bunch of hit shows, and you can pick whatever one is your own favorite hit show there. The depth of subjects discussed and covered in podcasts is very, very deep. Basically, if you can think of it, there's probably a podcast about it. And if there isn't one, maybe you could be the person to create it. Also, podcasts, in terms of format, there aren't any necessarily strict rules in the way that there might be rules on radio. There's no rules about length. A podcast can be any length it wants to be. It can be 5 minutes, it can be 50 minutes, it can be 5 hours. I don't recommend you release 5-hour podcasts, but you can do it if you want. In terms of the way that podcasts are constructed, as I said, it is open, but there are a number of formats that are very, very popular. One is the interview between maybe 2 or 3 people. 2 people is a very popular interview style. A panel discussion, maybe where there's a bunch of people who discuss a topic and they go back and forth. Also, can be quite popular is the monologue, one person monologuing about some topic. So there's also documentary style podcasts that might have complex audio recorded in a variety of different places and then put together with dramatic music, etc., etc. So podcasts are all of those, and they're also none of those. It's really up to yourself. Now, depending on who you talk to, you'll get different understandings as to what podcasts are. Some people do think of them as audio documentaries, the likes of Serial. But, things like the Tommy and Hector podcast or My Therapist Ghosted Me, they're extremely popular. It could also be, news podcasts, deep dive into news stories that maybe could go deeper than will be discussed on radio or even television, or even could be get into kind of more opinion pieces than necessarily something in a newspaper. It could be explainers. Really, a podcast is just a container for audio on demand. And we're not going to get into the video side of things because that's too complex and beyond the scope of this course, but that does obviously exist as well. How Stuff Works define podcasts as a free service that allow internet users to pull audio files, typically MP3s, from a podcasting website to listen to them on their computers or personal digital audio players, which for most people is a smartphone. Um, Websites like Learning Times, they describe podcasts as a digital broadcast made available on the internet. And the word podcast itself is derived from pod, as in Apple's iPod, which was a very popular portable audio player years ago, not that long ago, but in ancient history by modern technological standards. And cast, which comes from broadcast, meaning to transmit for general or public use. Podcast. Um, and when you consider how old podcasts or how old iPods are, you get a sense as to how old podcasts are. They've been around for quite a long while, but have become very popular over the last number of years. Now, the majority of podcasts are audio files sent to directories through XML feeds and RSS formatted XML. So that's RSS stands for really simple syndication, and XML stands for extensible markup language. These are technical. These are technologies. They look like computer code essentially. You don't need to worry about that too much because a lot of that is managed for you behind the scenes. But it is good to be aware that it exists. In the context of this course, I like to think of podcasts as informed conversations with direction. Now, this is actually a snapshot of the RSS feed for The Machine, which is a podcast that I produce and present from SET. This is basically what makes podcasting possible. It changes a piece of audio, i.e. an MP3, into a piece of information with context. Podcast readers or podcast app, they subscribe to this field and they know what episodes are available when a new episode is published and all the data we see around the podcast, such as the description, the artwork, etc., etc. It's kind of like a live library index card for the podcast. As I said, RSS, really simple syndication. Now, do you need to write one of these? Absolutely not. In the olden days of podcasts, yes, you did, but now the hosting platform that you'd use would produce this automatically. I'm just showing you so that you're aware that it's under the hood. And also, if you do produce your own podcast in the future, you may need to submit the RSS feed to a podcasting app like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, but at least you know what it is. Now, podcasts are hugely popular. That's not a particularly profound thing to say. In Ireland, we're podcast mad. When you look at the stats, you'll see that we have a massive number of Irish adults listening to podcasts regularly. And this actually increases significantly with people under the age of 45. As we get younger, more and more people are listening to podcasts. As I record this podcast at the end, or record this video, not a podcast, at the end of 2024, around 80% of people between the ages of 18 and 24 are listening to podcasts every week. I mean, that's a massive figure. Ireland also has one of the highest podcast listenerships in the world. And the graph on the right there relates to news podcasts, which shows Ireland enjoying third position for the highest listenership, behind the US and Sweden and tied with Australia. So there are a number of agencies who regularly release reports on podcast listening, like Edison Research or Reuters, and they're all available online if you care to look. Suffice to say, podcast listening has experienced a surge in popularity over the past number, and it remains part of many people's daily media consumption. One stat from a Podcast Insights report that I found very interesting is that nearly the whole of the audience, around 80%, listened to most of an episode or the entire episode rather than just a little bit. So people tend to listen to the whole thing, not just the start of it. So there seems to be a certain stickiness to podcasts. Now, so let's talk about the process. What's involved in actually creating a podcast? Well, it is a multi-stage process. You can skip through some of these stages, but you might end up with a substandard product. And often the mistakes that I hear novices make is where they just jump straight into opening a mic, off they go, and they haven't really planned things out. Now, there's no one right way to do this, but this is the way I do it. This is the way a lot of my friends, a lot of my colleagues would do it, and it seems to be working out okay. Now, it all begins with an idea. There's our little light bulb. What is the podcast? What's it about? It's a good idea to talk through your idea, work it through with other people. Chat about your idea with any potential collaborators, refine it, and go back and forth a few times. Don't just go with the first thing that pops into your head. So I'll give you an example of the machine, and we're going to use this as an example throughout this entire course. So the machine is a podcast about computer science. It started off as us wanting to create a podcast for computing students at SETU, chatting about some of the things that we cover in modules like programming, artificial intelligence, networking, etc., etc. We chatted with some colleagues, and then what we did was we made a subtle shift to not speak directly to our students, but to potential students. Might not sound like much of a change. Instead of talking to first year undergrads, we started thinking, no, we should be talking to leaving certs or fifth year students in secondary school. It's only a subtle change, but it did kind of make us think differently about the vocabulary that we might use on the podcast and the level of technical depth that we might go into in episodes. Now, and we're going to come back to this later on, and you're going to see why that makes sense. I'll talk to you about audiences in a bit. It's actually in the next section of the course. But the main takeaway that I want you to take from this, the takeaway that I want you to take from this, is that you need to think about what you want to do before you figure out how to do it. So whenever you want to record an episode, the same process is reproduced. And here's an idea. We have a plan, have a few chats, and we just go and get it done. So if the top line of that diagram is a kind of the idea stage or the planning stage, then down to the next bit is the next line is the kind of the technical stage. And this is where recording and editing comes in. It might actually be the bulk of the work, but if you've done the other stuff well, this becomes much simpler. If you haven't done your planning well, the technical side of things can increase in complexity significantly. So the technical side of things does obviously involve technology, microphones, computers, recorders. It doesn't have to be a full studio, and this equipment doesn't have to be terribly expensive. The microphones on newer laptops and smartphones are actually pretty good, though a dedicated mic will obviously be better. And you can pick up good ones for around about £100 online. Some people record in person, other people prefer to record online. Which is better? Personally, I prefer in person because I think you get a better back and forth between people. But it isn't always possible. And sometimes people might be on the other side of the world. There are online options from the likes of Zencastr, Riverside FM, and even Zoom can do a pretty good job. Now, once you have your podcast produced, it has to be uploaded to a hosting system, and unless you've built your own, you'll use one of the many services that are available, such as Acast, Megaphone, Podomatic, Spreaker. For a lot of the podcasts that I produce, I use Podcasters or Spotify for Podcasters, which is pretty good. We can actually combine all of those into what I call the 5 Ps of podcasting. So we've got planning and preparation. There's no technology involved in that. This can all be done on paper, or email. But, there you go. Planning and preparation. And then we have production, post-production, and publication. We're going to cover all aspects of these in this course. There is a 6th P, which is promotion. But that's more of a digital marketing exercise, and it wouldn't really be my strength. Now, when it comes to podcasting, certainly in an academic context, and what I mean by that is podcasting for university, I have some observations. They aren't particularly scientific, but they might be useful. First thing, it only works if you've got good people. I'm not a fan of the monologue podcast where there's just one person banging on, much like this video. Some people can do it very, very well, but it's quite rare. It's much better off if there's a back and forth between 2 or more people. The best ones also are conversational, but informative. What I mean by that is you're not just somebody coming in reading a script, that there's a dialogue back and forth between those people. Actually, when somebody comes in with a script, it's often the worst podcast because it just sounds like they're reading and they're usually stilted in their reading, and it can come off as fake. I said earlier that there's no set time when it comes to podcasts, but I have found that between 20 and 60 minutes is a good time for a podcast. If it's over 20 minutes, it means it's probably worth somebody's time listening to it. However, once it goes over an hour, it becomes if somebody's going to listen to this, it's going to take them, it's a commitment. So I like to try to keep podcasts under an hour if possible. I actually think 30 minutes is a magic number, because 30 minutes is a nice time where you can listen to a podcast, if you're commuting, if you're getting a bus, if you're walking from A to B, or even if you're doing something like cleaning up the kitchen or something. If you want to use materials in a podcast like music or images or anything like that, you should use royalty-free assets. You might think, oh yeah, I'm going to use a Taylor Swift song for my podcast. You cannot do that. You have to use royalty-free assets. Now, I'm going to talk to you later on in the course about places where you can find these, or you might be able to create them yourself. Who knows? If you're very good at Photoshop, you can create your own artwork. If you've got a musical background, you might want to create music, or you can just use something that somebody else has made. What I like about podcasting is that I think it's a great way to unlock expertise and knowledge, and it can help disseminate ideas and break down topics. The costs involved in podcasts are relatively low, and they can even be zero, to be honest with you. If you've already got a laptop, you can produce a podcast. It mightn't be any good, but you can do it. Now, I'm just going to play you a little clip of a podcast that I published a few years back on The Machine. It was a conversation with Connor O'Neill, who was a developer, a project manager with Nearform Technologies, and they were the developers of the COVID Tracker app. The whole podcast is about an hour. I'm only going to play a short clip of it. They developed this app in conjunction with the HSE. So you have Nearform, who are a kind of a very lean tech startup, and then you have the HSE, which is this very large public sector behemoth. And I asked Connor about what the culture clash was like.
This is going to sound like I'm blowing smoke, right? And it absolutely is not. It has been an eye-opener. My view would have been what you just described there. How the hell is this, scrappy, Irish startup that's famous for moving incredibly quickly and dodging and weaving, going to be able to work with this, what we thought would be slow-moving behemoth of thousands and thousands of employees? And not just that, because and I think it is important to say, but people always say the HSE, but it's the HSE and the Department of Health. Like this is they worked together on this.
Two institutions.
Yes. So you think our problems are doubled, and they weren't at all. So
you can listen to the whole podcast if you want. It's an interesting kind of case study in what happens when public-private partnership in a tech sector. And also at the time, this was recorded during COVID, and the COVID Tracker app was on everyone's phone. So it was a kind of an interesting topic. And the fact that we were able to kind of delve deep into how this thing was created, it kind of suited the podcast format, because it was a conversation between myself and Connor, rather than necessarily a case study piece of text. So so there you go. Now, we're only starting the journey here. This course is only an introduction. The best way to dive deep into podcasts is to just give it a go. Hopefully this course will prepare you to accelerate quickly when you want to get on with your own podcast creation. As a piece of ungraded homework, I would encourage you to listen to some podcasts that are outside of your comfort zone. If you normally listen to sports podcasts, try true crime. Or if you listen to news podcasts, listen to a drama. Or if you listen to drama, listen to a news podcast. Or maybe listen to an interview type show that you wouldn't normally go for. Or perhaps you have an interest or a hobby. There's probably a podcast out there about that. Do a search on your podcast app of choice and see what